This is by far one of the most modular and flexible cases I've ever worked with. This is the Dark Base 700 from Be Quiet. Before we start anything, this case is $180 US. I'm going to try to go as far in depth as I can about this case without missing the overall theme. Personally, I believe this has a lot to offer, and here's why. What's up guys, it's JD from JDTechGear and welcome back to the channel. The Be Quiet Dark Base 700 is unlike any case I've worked with before, simply due to the attention to detail on every level. There's only a few case manufacturers I've worked with so far with this level of detail, and that manufacturer is Fantex. The Dark Base 700 has plenty of professional reviews already, and a lot of them were left with mixed feelings, but I'm going to do my best to analyze every bit of this case that I can to make it feel as real life as possible through this review. So before we get any further into that, let's go through the features of this case. This is a full metal case. Yes, the top and front panel are not only going for the brushed aluminum look, but it's the real deal too. There's integrated RGB LEDs on the front panel, which looks amazing in my opinion, giving off this Tron-esque vibe. The soft glow is a beautiful touch to add with the minimalism look of the case. The color options are white, red, green, blue, orange, and purple. They can either be static or breathing, and there is the option to cycle through all the colors. Or if you'd like to take it a step further, you can control the LEDs through your motherboard RGB controller with the RGB header located on the fan hub. More on that in a bit. This case is 544mm long, 241mm wide, and 519mm tall with motherboard support from eATX to mini ITX. Talk about versatility for a mid-tower. There's fan support of up to two 120 or 140mm fans on the front and three 120 or 140mm fans up top and a single 120 or 140mm fan in the rear. You can place an additional fan on the bottom of the case where the hard drive cage is. Also, we've got dust filters on the front panel and another one spanning the entire length of the case on the bottom. Unfortunately, for the top mounted fans, there is barely any ventilation for intake or exhaust due to the ventilation slits only covering a small portion of the top panel. It seems silly to me to have top mounted fans because of this. However, the top panel is removable, adding to the flexibility of this case. It would be cool to see an additional option to replace the top panel with a panel with more vents to breathe through. So I mean, there's always that possibility. For the top mounted fans, there is a removable tray that is held in with two screws, one on each side of the case of course. The fan mounting tray slides out and you can install your fans without any issue. I always admire slide out fan mounting trays, although again, all of this is sort of shorthanded due to the lack of ventilation at the top of the case. The hardware packaging comes in a cardboard box, which includes installation screws, Velcro straps, and an additional drive tray. Oddly enough, there are no included PSU screws, which is fine since power supplies come with their own set of screws, but additional ones would have been nice to see. Also, all the different types of screws are labeled in the manual, but they all come in Ziploc bags. I still hold a standard for my Fantex Enthu Pro, which had a plastic assortment box for all the different hardware, which is brilliant. This is a nitpick for me though, because the build quality of this case is superb, and I don't know what the bill of materials is in order to determine an appropriate profit margin to be able to include in an accessory assortment box. Continuing with the rest of the features, since this case is $180, it of course has tempered glass. The glass is fantastic quality, of course, measuring at 4mm of thickness with frosted edges and black handling bars at the top and bottom of the panel. The removal and installation is pretty standard. Unscrew the 4 thumb screws, which do have built-in rubber washers by the way, and unhinge the glass panel. This method is perfectly fine, but the tempered glass removal on the Inwin 101 is still my absolute favorite. Pull the pins out at the top and unhinge, and the black plastic bars keep fingerprints off of the glass, so that's really nice. I would have liked to have seen something like that, or that sort of ease with the tempered glass removal, but honestly it's not a huge deal since the process is already easy enough. But it does leave fingerprints on the front of the glass since the black handling bars are only on the back of the glass. The front panel is removed by pulling at the edges and sliding it out of place. It is also wireless in terms of connectivity to the RGB LEDs. There is a contact point at the bottom panel, so be mindful when removing the front panel. As you can probably tell, the airflow is quite restrictive, but this is a sacrifice made for silence. Honestly, I would like to see a little bit more compromise on the silence for airflow. Perhaps if the vents on the front front panel came in more towards the center to gain a couple of centimeters, I believe it would be a better balance between airflow and silence. Plus, the look of the ventilation LED outline looks great. So both from an aesthetic and functional standpoint, I think my ventilation idea would be suitable. The top panel can be removed with 4 screws on each side, so a total of 8. So 2 screws in the front of the case and 2 screws in the rear, on both sides of course. It's not really meant to be taken off, but it can, and it can open up the entire frame for more clearance and ease of use, which is incredibly rare to see, so kudos to Be Quiet for that. It is a bit tricky to remove since it's attached to the front I/O. It took me a bit of time to carefully remove the top panel because of the front I/O ports. And lastly, the rear panel is easy to take on and off by sliding it out. Thumb screws on the back are capped, which is awesome, so you won't have to worry about losing any pesky fugitive thumb screws. Also, all the panels, except for the tempered glass window of course, has sound dampening material on it. Inside the case, it is nice and open, and there are plenty of ways to change the insides around. There's rubber grommets located in the appropriate places, and for me, the more the merrier. I love the use of rubber grommets, I really do. The PSU shroud is modular, so if you want to place a radiator at the front, you'll be able to be given the clearance to do so by removing the plastic cover in the front. You can remove the panel next to it and add an additional fan over the hard drive cages, and the last few panels open up for more ventilation to the power supply and additional cable routing. You can also remove the sidewall of the PSU shroud by pressing on the top of the sidewall and pushing it out of place, and open the side for additional accessibility. Not only that, but you can install it on the other side of the PSU shroud if you decide to invert the motherboard tray, which you can do too. The entire motherboard tray is invertible, which is rare to see, but nonetheless it is an option. Just unscrew the screws tying down the motherboard tray to the frame and flip it around. The screws are located by the front panel and the rear of the case. Keep in mind the rear wall gets flipped around alongside with it. Honestly, I thought it was going to be a pain, but the process was actually fairly easy. Once the tray is flipped around, the rear side panel and tempered glass panel swap places. You can remove the tempered glass standoffs and install them on the other side, and like I mentioned earlier, you can swap the side of the PSU sidewall, and you can get that all flipped around so it all goes back into place. I don't know how many people will make use of this feature, but it does show off how modular the case is. Not to mention, you can take off the motherboard tray and install all of your components on it and install it back into place. This case is incredibly flexible. The back of the motherboard tray has rubber feet to place onto a surface and also reduce vibration between the rear panel and the contact with the inner wall. On a side note, this case has the option for vertical GPU mounting, but unfortunately there is no included PCIe extension cable to do so. Storage options with this case is really nice and continues the theme of flexibility and modularity. There's 2 drive cages at the bottom of the case, plus the additional one included in the accessories box. These can be fully removed and replaced with the sidewall cover plates. You can pop any of these out for your best convenience and install a drive cage. They can be a bit of a pain to pull out since you need to squeeze 3 tabs simultaneously in order to uninstall and reinstall it. Not only can you use the sidewall plates for the drive cages, but you can also partially pop them out to fit cables through for cable management. This will work nicely if you have an E-ATX board and the board covers up the rubber grommets slightly on the sides, again with the flexibility. SSDs can either be placed on the drive cage or the 3 SSD trays in the rear, all of which are removable. The SSD tray bracket behind the motherboard is easily removed with a thumb screw, and all of this really maximizes the different storage options for this case. Since the drive cages can be removed from the bottom, you can remove the entire mounting bracket for them and gain clearance to fit a larger power supply. The power supply also has rubber strips to sit on to reduce any vibrational noise. So now let's talk about the front I/O. We've got 2 USB 3.0 headers, LED controller button, power button, audio jacks, USB 3.1 Type-C port, and a fan controller. The inclusion of the Type-C port is fantastic to see, and I am ecstatic that they included it. The fan option is really nice to have with 3 different speeds and an auto option as well. The fan hub on the back has support up to 6 fans with 2 separate rails. Both rails can be set to either performance or silent, creating different combinations of cooling and silence based on what your needs are. This is a fantastic detail to the fan hub that I truly admire, and it really pushes the thought that's put into this case. All the front I/O cables are good quality, but unfortunately, the HD audio cable is not fully braided or fully covered. I've never came across any case that has done this. Maybe it's unnecessary? I mean, I don't know. I'm not sure, but I would have really appreciated if it was braided or something. In the grand scheme of things, this is a nitpick. Also, it would be nice to see some sort of housing to place all the front I/O connectors in to make the process a little bit easier and just all around better. The front I/O cables are standard for the most part, but I would like to see a little bit more thought put into them considering the price tag and the attention to detail everywhere else with this case. But this is not a major issue. Again, I believe it is just worth mentioning. In terms of build quality, this case is excellent. Despite the HD audio cable connector, every single part of this case is crafted with quality and durability, from the thumb screws to the panels to the rubber washers on the motherboard tray screws and to the plastic panels used on the PSU shroud. There are different grades of plastic. This is made with ABS plastic, which is a relatively high grade plastic. People argue, there's PBT and other types of plastic, but ABS has strong durability for its price point. The only thing is it may shine a little bit sooner than PBT or possibly wear a little bit faster, but ABS plastic is still a good quality plastic. You know what else makes the quality of this case so good? The modularity of this case. Take a look at this case completely stripped down. I tore down this case as much as I possibly could, excluding the front IO, and it is absolutely awesome. Just judging by all the panels and the hardware I stripped away from the case, it really puts it all into perspective with how much you can remove and change around and work with. It really takes thought, time, and money, which brings me back to my point. This is a high quality case. For the build experience, it was very enjoyable throughout. One thing I particularly liked a lot was the fact that you can take off the PSU sidewall. I forgot to plug in one more cable into the power supply, so I was able to have access to the PSU from both sides to install that cable without having to uninstall the power supply. A couple things to make note of while building with this case is that I highly recommend removing the top fan mounting tray when installing any cables that go to the top of the motherboard. Also, installing the CPU power connector is a bit tricky since it's really hard to aim where you're plugging that connector in while looking from the side or top profile of the case. You can remove the top panel, but it's quite a process to remove, so I didn't think it was worth it while plugging in the CPU connector. So I just aimed while looking through the top panel air slits. Again, in future editions of this case, I'd like to see easier top panel removal without it being connected to the front IO ports. Another thing that I noticed while routing the cables is that the rubber grommets would come off quite easily. Not a huge deal, there's only so much you can do for a rubber grommet to stay in place, and these seem pretty standard to any other rubber grommets I've dealt with in the past. For cable management, this case has cable holes for almost everything. All the fans in the front have cable holes. The top of the motherboard tray is open for routing. The rubber grommets do their job as they should, as well as the modular HDD slots. The only thing that may be a bit of a challenge is the bottom mounted cables like the IO and the HD audio connectors. There are options to route through the PSU shroud from the top, but you would have to remove the PSU covers to do it neatly. I was able to fit the cables through the opening on the bottom of the tray. For the rear of the case, there is plenty of space to use for cable management. There's plenty of tie down options and whatnot, but there is a lack of cable channeling used. Alternatively, you can use the rear of the modular HDD slots for the cable routing, and surprisingly, it works well, so it kind of makes up for it, but I would like to see some more cable channeling in the rear for future editions. Now let's go over thermal and noise performance. As you can tell from the front panel, the airflow is quite restricted, but let's see how thermal and noise performance held up with the fan controller. So for testing, I'm using Intel 8600K clocked at 5 GHz with the DarkRock Pro 3 cooling the CPU. There are 4 Silent Wing 140mm fans inside the case, which should be optimal. The original 2 fans are fine, but won't be enough for this type of cooling in my opinion. The fan hub has both rails set to silent mode for this test, not performance. So stressing the CPU, FPU, and cache with ID64, here are the 4 fan settings, with 1 being the lowest and 3 being the highest setting. I know these temps might be concerning, but 5 GHz for the 8600K is going to be very warm. Anyways, as you can expect, these temps are raised slightly higher with each lower fan setting. The decibel level remained relatively close because as the fan setting went lower, the CPU fan would have to adjust for the offset in airflow and kick up the RPM. While yes, fan setting 1 is notably quieter than fan setting 3, there is a 5-degree difference in temperature. It's not too bad in terms of temperature difference, but if you're rendering a project or any other CPU intensive task, I'd recommend placing the fan setting to 3 for the time being. 44.3 decibels really isn't that bad in terms of noise. With the front panel completely off, temps dropped to 75 degrees Celsius. The Sapphire Nitro RX 580 ran at 73 degrees Celsius max during the superposition benchmark, which is a healthy temperature for that workload. In terms of normal operation or idling, each of the fan settings produced close results in noise production. Fan setting 1 is ridiculously quiet at 40.1 decibels. This case can cool your components in my opinion. The noise cancellation aspect of this case is forfeited for heavy workloads though. The silent aspect works well for casual and medium workload tasks, but the heavy workloads will be traded for silence. For my closing thoughts, I've heard and read a lot of mixed reviews about this case for the $170 to $180 price mark. This case is specific. It's not meant for everyone, obviously. This has to be one of the more expensive mid-tower cases I've seen in a while, but it's not grossly overpriced. I think for $160, this case would be near perfect. Not to mention, there's 2 do include 140mm silent wing fans, which is a $50 value. Maybe if they offered a fanless version of this case and sold it for $140-ish, they might be able to attract more buyers to this case. Here's the caveat though, this case is so high quality, I have no idea where the profit margin is on this case. A lot of other cases are manufactured off a base model and slightly modified to keep costs down. With this case, everything is engineered from scratch, or at least it feels like. So I can't really determine what an appropriate price would be for this case. I can only go of what my experience is and what my knowledge is. So if it was me buying this case for a high-end build, I would definitely do it just for the sake of knowing the amount of thought that went into this case. The only issues I have to point out with this case is that I would like a little bit more attention to airflow by extending the ventilation towards the center of the front panel and having more ventilation on top for the top mounted fans. I would also like to see a top panel that is easier to remove and not connected to the front I/O, because it is a pain to get it back into place properly and getting all the USB ports lined up just right. The other things are minor but still worth noting. I would like to see some better cable routing in the rear. It's decent, it has room for all the cables, which is no problem, but cable channeling is essential. I think that the hardware accessories packaging could be a bit better than the standard plastic bags. The other thing is that the HD audio cable is not fully coated at the end and the multicolor wires stick out. And finally, the last thing is I would like to see some sort of housing for all the front I/O cables going into the motherboard. That would be awesome. With that being said, this case does a lot right, in my opinion. The modularity and versatility of this case is on another level. I absolutely love the flexibility I have while working with this case. Just being able to remove things and break the case down to its most basic frame and work with it from any angle. This takes a lot of time and effort to be engineered into a case. Not only that, but it all has to be done where the consumer can do it and understand it easily, especially the inverted motherboard tray. Just the fact that it can be removed so easily and you can assemble your PC from the outside is outstanding. The quality of the materials used for this case is fantastic quality, and there's almost no place in this case you can't access. Aesthetics are preference, but I love the look of this case. It is so sleek and stealthy, and the integrated RGB lighting is done beautifully. It's stunning to look at, and it can be used as a furniture piece for an office. You can check out my build video with this case that really shows it in its full glory. The only change about the aesthetic I would like to see is a different look than the brushed aluminum. I believe Dimitri from Hardware Canucks mentioned this in his review, and I agree with him. The brushed aluminum looks great, it looks fantastic, but it's becoming overdone. It's just a shame because these panels are actually aluminum, so having the brushed aluminum completely works. But I think a sleek alternative would be a dark wood grain pattern. It would just look so good with this case and just different, unique, and classy. Although wood may be a bit tougher to incorporate into a case, but I think it would be worth it. This case is cutting edge. It's unlike anything I built in and tore down before. Well, it's in a minority at least. If you're doing a high-end build, I would highly recommend this case for full customization and take full advantage of all of its capabilities. I hope you really enjoyed this video and found it helpful. It took me a long time to do a full review of the Dark-Base 700 to properly understand each and every piece of it so that I can walk you guys through this entire experience. So let me know if you like this type of in-depth analysis for these cases by leaving a like, and if you're new here and like seeing these types of videos, consider subscribing for more. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.